Who would have thought someone from the 12th century, about 800 over years ago, can still have such a very powerful impact on us today? He has influenced not only the 16th century Saint Ignatius of Loyola to imitate him in poverty, to serve God, but that he continued to influence even our former 21st century Pope, who was not only inspired by him, but even took his name that he might continue to be guided by him. So while for many of us Jesuits, when we heard the name Francis was taken, we thought it was Saint Francis Xavier. And we were surprised and shocked to find that he meant Saint Francis of Assisi. So as Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet says, what's in a name? Representing the many of us who also took on a name, either at our baptism or confirmation, and later forget about what the name is all about. Pope Francis went on to live it almost immediately after his election, when he saw Vinicio Riva at the general audience, a man suffering from neurofibromatosis type 1, a genetic disorder which affected his appearance that people would stay away from him. But Pope Francis went on to embrace him with much affection. That one can say at that moment, at that very moment, the world stopped for a minute. Many of us felt scared for Pope Francis, for fear that he should contract the disease. But the man of faith did not hesitate to do what he was called to do. The Francis of our time. Pictures of that moment went viral all over the world. It was so powerful because it spoke of a love that no one would have thought of would exist. And it spoke of an act that none of us would dare to do. But for some of us who know the story of Saint Francis of Assisi, we might recall that moment in Assisi after a dream at Spoleto that turned his life around. Francis got down from the horse when he saw a leper, a sight that used to fill him with disgust. But this time, he went to the leper and embraced him with affection. Last week, our gospel made us aware that our world is a wounded world. A gulf exists in our world, in our country, in our church, between the haves and the haves not, a gulf that we have often turned a blind eye to, between us and the Lazaruses around us. And that we are called not to get so caught up with our world, not to be so obsessed with ourselves, but to see that there are people outside the world around us, that there are human persons who are in need rejected, deprived, outcasted, unloved, lonely, right outside the door of our lives. As St. Francis saw, not a leper, but a brother. If St. Ignatius had talked about seeing God in all things, then we should not be surprised if he had also been inspired by St. Francis' relations and love for all things in God. That the created world is, as it were, a sacrament of the free gifts of creation coming from the hand of God, the way Paul tells the Romans. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. Saint Bonaventure noted this of Francis when he said, when he, referring to Francis, considered the primordial source of all things, he was filled with abundant piety, calling them creatures, no matter how small, by the name of brother and sister, because he knew that they had the same source as himself. So I will ask ourselves is, if our contemporaries were to know anything about St. Francis, it tends to be about his love for nature and animals. It is true that St. Francis loved animals and the beauties of the natural world, like sun, moon, stars, flowers, and the fruits of the Mother Earth. But we should also be cautious about sentimentalizing St. Francis with animals, that by our obsession with our pet dogs or cats or snakes or whatever, we ignored the humans around us. And likewise, to think that the encyclical Laudato Si, which is always associated with St. Francis, is all about planting trees, when it is actually a social encyclical. Explaining the reason for Laudato Si, Pope Francis said, St. Francis shows us just how inseparable the bond is between the concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. As such, for those who are involved in the care of creation, we should be able to find that it is not just about planting a tree or picking up the rubbish, but that it is about rediscovering our place, rediscovering our Christian faith in the larger whole of God's creation. That in this recognition of our creaturehood may help to heal the wounded and the scattered parts of our lives. In the encyclical, Pope Francis also said, Francis helps us to see that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcends the language of mathematics and biology and takes us to the heart of what it is to be human. Just like what happened when we fall in love with someone, that whenever Francis could gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. His response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. Because for Francis, each and every creature was a sister, united to him by bonds of affections. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists, like his master Jesus, who remained obedient to his Father. And like us, who tend to care for only the selected few, Francis saw his life in imitation of his master through the gospel, whom God sent for all, not some, but for all, because he so loved the world, not just those he liked. So if we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we see that which belongs only to us, and if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationships with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limit on the immediate needs. But when we are able to see the beauty of creation and the love of the Creator, we will be able to see who we really are. That it should be not difficult for us to say, after all, with all the works that we have done, we are merely servants. We have done no more than our duty. I have to admit as well that if we were to look at our world, it is full of problems. That perhaps when we look at how much the problem is, we feel so small that we be overwhelmed, wondering how we will be able to deal with them. If we look at the context of our gospel today, we will find our similarities with the disciples. They were overwhelmed as well over how they were going to follow Jesus and follow Jesus' way. Earlier in the passage, if you go earlier from today's gospel, you will find they saw the consequences of causing others to sin. And it would be better for him if a millstone were put around his neck and he be thrown into the sea, and for him to cause one of these little ones to sin. And Jesus also told them about forgiving, that if someone were to wrong us 7 times in one day and return to us 7 times, saying, I am sorry, we should forgive the person. It is as though we should not be tired of forgiving. It sounded ridiculous, absurd, as though we can forgive that person all the time who doesn't seem to change. But isn't that what God has been doing for us each time we go to the confessionals? That God always forgives us. It feels like there is so much demanded of us as Christians that I'm sure at least once we have also said to Jesus, increase our faith, thinking that with more faith we can be a better disciple. But Jesus shifts our attention from thinking about quantity to consider the quality of the faith we already have. He said even a tiny bit of faith, like the size of a mustard seed, can be very powerful. Jesus wants us to act on the faith we already have. If we read the stories about lives of saints, we will realize that their lives began alone as well. A single mustard seed can grow. A seed that was able to connect, to relate with its creator, and find strength from it. Perhaps we might want to ask ourselves, what have my experience of God been so far? Or when was the last time I personally experienced God? It was at Spoleto that Francis was given a dream that asked him which Lord was most fitting for service, the master or the servant. The master referred to God, while the servant refers to Walter of Brienne, a French nobleman and military leader whose crusade Francis was heading to join. When Francis answered the master, he was told to give up on his nightly service he was eager about and to head home. The Spoleto experience changed Francis' life, turning him away from the violent world that he was accustomed to, from family wealth and from public prestige, to an entirely new way as God's instrument of peace in the world. So if we think saints are born different, then we might be surprised to find that Francis was very much like us, caught up in the life of the world, because all we see are what we are told we could have. If you remember Jesus' temptation in the desert, the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him the kingdom of the world in their magnificence. The devil told Jesus he will give all this to Jesus if he will prostrate himself and worship him. And that was all the devil could do. Because in reality, nothing belongs to the devil. While the world he is offering seems everything to us that we keep chasing. For Francis, something happened at Spoleto. Nothing much was said except the dream. A dream that turned his life radically around, that upon waking up, he wanted to do the things Christ did. He wanted to live the gospel life. It was then that he met the leper. And so, while many of us may have read the gospel stories about lepers, Jesus healing the lepers, we probably do not see how challenging it is until perhaps a leper is right in front of us, if we will embrace him, asking us if we are really serious about the gospel life we want to live. Saint Francis embraced the leper. Pope Francis embraced Vinicio Riva. Our life living in faith is not a life lived in abstraction as if God is beyond our reach. Our encounter with the Word of God each week that we come to church, in our daily readings to hear scriptures, telling us that God is ever near to us, always reaching out to us, always speaking to us. Do we see him? Do we hear him? While our gospel today may present to us that we are only servants, the evangelist John gives us a more intimate image of the servant-master relationship when Jesus says, I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. If we can see this friendship with Jesus and feel intimately united with the Father, we should not be surprised at how Francis saw the world as intimately united with everything that exists. The poverty and austerity of Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled, as if everything we see is for our use and throw away when we no longer want them, the way we may have treated many of our relationships. As we celebrate St. Francis' life, it might help for us to take a moment to think over how we ourselves see life, that beautiful gift from God, and not just itself, but everything life around us. And if we have been faithful to what it is meant to be about our life, Francis may have lived 800 years ago, but there is much that he is still trying to impart, which we have not fully grasped. But we will, if we, like Francis, keep referring to the gospel to guide the way we live our lives, and by doing so, to bring Christ forth into our world. A little story after the election of Pope Francis. Shortly after his election, Pope Francis was asked why he chose the name Francis. He replied that during the conclave, he was seated next to his friend, the Brazilian Cardinal Claudio Humes. And it became clear that the cardinals had elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio to be the Pope. Cardinal Humes embraced his friend and said, "Don't forget the poor." It was at that moment that the newly elected Pope immediately thought of Francis of Assisi, who was, he said, a man of peace, a man of poverty, a man who loved and protected creation. As we celebrate his life, the beauty of the person he is, will you have a place in your life for Francis? Father Paul also asked me to say a few words in Malay, and I'm not too sure about this. But maybe just very short one that hari ini kita mengenang seorang insan agung, seorang kudus pada zaman dan juga zaman kita. Mungkin kita tidak menyangka bahawa seorang yang lahir lebih 800 tahun dahulu boleh memberi pengaruh yang begitu besar kepada zaman kita. Satu roh yang perlu kita teladani dalam cara beliau mengikuti Yesus dengan mengikuti ajaran Injil. dan menjadikan cara hidup Injil cara hidup kita. Kita sering mengatakan kita mengikut Yesus, tetapi adakah kita benar-benar menjadikan Injil sebagai cara hidup kita? Untuk berbuat demikian, kita akan sedar bahawa ia bukan mudah, kerana jalan Injil sangat berbeza daripada jalan dunia. Mungkin kita perlu melihat dalam keadaan kehidupan kita. Beranikah kita memeluk orang yang mengidap penyakit kusta? Dunia mementingkan diri sendiri, tetapi Injil mengambil berat tentang ciptaan Allah. Sebab itulah hari ini kita banyak mendengar tentang menjaga ciptaan, dan ini bukan sekadar anjing atau haiwan pemeliharaan kita, atau hanya di tempat yang kita tinggal, tetapi seluruh ciptaan, termasuk manusia, terutamanya yang terpinggir, ditolak dan tidak disayangi. Dan jika kita mendapati diri kita melakukan hal itu dengan kasih, kita akan mendapati kehidupan kita dalam jalan kasih Injil. Sukar, tetapi ia amat menyembuhkan, ia membolehkan kita merangkul hati Francis dan Kristus.